Have you ever noticed how some people become strangely obsessed the moment you stop giving them access to your attention? Not because you argued with them, not because you fought back, not because you disappeared dramatically, but because you simply stopped reacting. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped defending your choices. You stopped trying to convince people to understand you. And suddenly, everything changed. The same people who barely noticed your presence began wondering where you were. The ones who ignored your kindness suddenly demanded your attention. Those who once controlled every emotional reaction found themselves standing before someone they could no longer predict. But why does this happen? Why does silence often speak louder than arguments? Why does emotional distance make some people respect you while making others desperately try to pull you back into old patterns? Carl Jung believed that most human relationships are not built on genuine understanding, but on unconscious expectations. People become comfortable with the version of you they have learned to predict. They expect your immediate reply. They expect your endless patience. They expect your explanations, your forgiveness, your emotional availability. And without realizing it, you slowly become a prisoner of the role they assign to you. A role that has very little to do with who you truly are. The frightening part is that this prison rarely has visible walls. It is built from habits, from guilt, from fear of disappointing others, from the silent belief that if you stop giving people what they expect, they might stop loving you altogether. So you keep giving, you keep explaining, you keep fixing, you keep proving, until one day you wake up emotionally exhausted, wondering why everyone seems to take pieces of you while no one truly sees you. According to Jung, this is where the journey of individuation begins. Not when you change the world around you, but when you stop allowing the world to define who you must be. Because the moment you become emotionally difficult to control, you force everyone around you to face something they have been avoiding for years, themselves. And that is exactly why your silence makes some people uncomfortable. It is not your absence they fear. It is the loss of their influence over you. Tonight, we're going to explore one of Carl Jung's most profound psychological insights: why becoming less available is not an act of rejection, but the first unmistakable sign that you are finally becoming free. For most of your life, you were probably taught that being available was a virtue. Be kind, be understanding, answer quickly, never disappoint people, never let anyone feel abandoned. At first, these lessons sound noble. They create the image of a compassionate person, someone others can rely on. But hidden beneath these values lies a dangerous psychological trap, because somewhere along the way, many people stop being kind by choice and start being available out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing others, fear of being forgotten. Without realizing it, they no longer act according to their own values. They act according to the emotional expectations of everyone around them. Little by little, their identity begins to dissolve. Carl Jung believed that every human being develops what he called the persona. The persona is not your true self. It is the version of yourself that learns how to survive socially. It smiles when it feels exhausted. It agrees when it wants to disagree. It laughs when it feels hurt. It apologizes for things that were never its responsibility. The persona is incredibly useful. Without it, society would be chaos. But there is a problem. Most people spend so much time protecting the persona that they eventually forget the person hiding behind it. Imagine wearing a mask every single day. At first, you know it is only a mask, but after years, you stop remembering your own face. That is exactly what happens psychologically. The approval you receive is no longer directed toward your authentic self. It is directed toward the character you have been performing. And because the applause feels good, you keep performing. You become the reliable friend, the understanding partner, the patient employee, the son or daughter who never complains, the person who is always emotionally available. Everyone admires you. Everyone praises your generosity. But almost nobody asks a simple question: what is this constant availability costing you? Every time you ignore your own exhaustion to satisfy someone else's expectations, a small part of your inner life is sacrificed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, day after day, conversation after conversation, compromise after compromise. Eventually, something strange begins to happen. You wake up feeling emotionally tired before the day has even started. You answer messages that you don't want to answer. You attend gatherings that drain you. You explain yourself to people who never intended to understand you. You carry emotional responsibilities that were never yours to carry. And because this pattern has existed for so long, it starts feeling normal. But it is not normal. It is psychological conditioning, one of the most subtle forms of self-abandonment. Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious eventually directs our lives. If you never become aware of why you need other people's approval, that need will quietly make every important decision for you. It will decide when you speak, when you remain silent, who you tolerate, who you fear, who you desperately try to keep. And the tragedy is that you will believe these choices are yours. But they are not. They belong to an unconscious part of your mind that learned many years ago that love had to be earned. Perhaps through obedience, perhaps through perfection, perhaps through usefulness. Children naturally adapt to survive emotionally. If affection only arrived when they behaved a certain way, they learned to become whatever others expected. The problem is that many adults never stop living by those childhood rules. Their bodies grow older. Their responsibilities become greater. But psychologically, they're still trying to earn the love they feared losing decades ago. That is why becoming less available feels terrifying at first. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your unconscious mind interprets boundaries as danger. It whispers, asterisk, if you stop giving, they will leave. Asterisk, asterisk, if you say no, they won't love you. Asterisk, asterisk, if you protect yourself, you will end up alone. Asterisk, these fears are powerful, but they are rarely true, because authentic relationships are not destroyed by healthy boundaries. Only transactional ones are. And that is the uncomfortable realization many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Sometimes, the people who become most upset by your boundaries were the ones benefiting the most from your lack of them. That realization changes everything, because once you see it, you can never become blind to it again. And that is precisely where Carl Jung takes us next. Because if the persona explains why we become emotionally available, there's another force operating beneath it, one far older, far more instinctive, and infinitely more powerful. The unconscious hunger for emotional energy. And until you understand how that invisible exchange works, you will continue giving away pieces of yourself without ever knowing where they went. Imagine waking up every morning with a limited amount of invisible currency. You cannot see it. You cannot hold it in your hands. Yet every decision you make spends a portion of it. Every argument, every unnecessary explanation, every attempt to convince someone who has already decided not to understand you. Every moment you replay an old conversation inside your head. Every ounce of resentment you carry into tomorrow. Little by little, you become emotionally bankrupt. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche functions through the movement of psychic energy. Although he described it differently from physical energy, the principle remains remarkably similar. Where your attention goes, your life follows. Most people believe they are exhausted because they work too much, but often that is not the real reason. Some people work 12 hours a day and still feel deeply alive. Others do almost nothing, yet they wake up drained. The difference is not always physical effort. It is psychological leakage. Energy escapes through unfinished emotional conflicts, through constant people-pleasing, through hidden resentment, through anxiety about situations that have not even happened. The mind keeps paying interest on emotional debts that no longer exist. Think about the last person who hurt you. Maybe it happened months ago, perhaps years. Maybe you never told anyone. But if that person can still occupy your thoughts without even knowing your name anymore, they are still spending your energy, without asking permission, without even being present. That is one of the greatest paradoxes of the human mind. The body can leave a room, but consciousness often stays behind. Jung understood something most people never realize. Attention is not passive. Attention is participation. Whatever repeatedly captures your attention begins shaping your inner reality. This is why manipulation rarely begins with control. It begins with distraction. If someone can keep you emotionally reacting, they never need to dominate your actions. Your own mind will do the work for them. Notice how easily people become trapped. A critical comment ruins an entire afternoon. One unanswered message destroys a peaceful evening. A stranger's opinion becomes more important than years of personal growth. The event itself lasts seconds, but the psychological reaction can last weeks, sometimes months, sometimes decades. The unconscious does not distinguish between a physical threat and an emotional one as clearly as we imagine. A memory can activate the same internal alarm long after the danger has disappeared. That is why unresolved emotions quietly consume so much psychic energy. Not because the past is still happening, but because your nervous system believes it is. This is why emotionally mature people appear calm. It is not because they have fewer problems. It is because they have become extremely selective about what deserves access to their inner world. They no longer chase every misunderstanding. They no longer feel obligated to defend every accusation. They no longer mistake urgency for importance. Instead, they observe, they breathe, they wait. Silence becomes a filter. Not every emotion deserves expression. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every conflict deserves participation. And this is where true psychological strength begins. Not in controlling other people, but in refusing to surrender your attention to everything that demands it. Because attention is life, and life is finite. Every unnecessary emotional battle costs you something you will never recover. Time, presence, peace. The tragedy is that many people discover this only after years of emotional exhaustion. After giving everything to everyone except themselves. Carl Jung once suggested that what remains unconscious continues to influence us until it appears to be fate. Perhaps what many call bad luck is actually misplaced attention. Perhaps what feels like constant emotional exhaustion is simply years of investing your inner life in people, conflicts, and expectations that never deserved such priceless currency. And if your attention has the power to shape your reality, then protecting it becomes far more than self-care. It becomes an act of psychological freedom. But there is one question that still remains unanswered. If your energy is so valuable, why are some people irresistibly drawn to taking it? Why do certain individuals become restless, even angry, the moment you stop reacting? To understand that, we must enter one of Carl Jung's most misunderstood ideas: projection. Because most people are not responding to who you truly are. They are responding to the version of you that exists inside their own unconscious. And that changes everything. There is something deeply unsettling about becoming difficult to read. Most people don't realize how much of everyday life depends on predictability. Not because predictability creates love, but because it creates control. Think about the people who know exactly how to make you react. They know which words make you defensive, which topics make you anxious, which memories make you feel guilty, which accusations force you to explain yourself. They don't always do this consciously. Many aren't even aware of it, but the pattern is there. Over time, every relationship develops an emotional map. People learn where your invisible buttons are, and once they know where those buttons are, they no longer need to understand you. They only need to press them. This is why changing your behavior feels so threatening to others. Not because you become cold, but because the old map suddenly stops working. Carl Jung believed that one of the most powerful forces operating beneath human relationships is projection. Projection happens when we unconsciously attribute parts of ourselves to someone else. The qualities we admire, the fears we refuse to face, the anger we cannot admit, the weakness we deny. Instead of recognizing these parts within ourselves, we experience them through other people. Imagine looking into a mirror covered with dust. Instead of cleaning the mirror, you blame the reflection. That is projection. It allows the unconscious to avoid responsibility. It protects the ego from uncomfortable truths. But it comes at a cost. Reality becomes distorted. This explains why two people can experience the same individual in completely different ways. One sees confidence. Another sees arrogance. One sees independence. Another sees rejection. One sees silence. Another hears contempt. The person hasn't changed. The observer has. Most reactions tell us more about the one reacting than about the person being observed. This is why your emotional independence becomes so disruptive. The moment you stop chasing approval, people lose the familiar version of you they had created inside their minds. And something unexpected happens. Their own unconscious begins searching for an explanation. Some will decide that you have become selfish. Others will accuse you of changing. Some will insist that you are distant, cold, unkind. But notice something fascinating. These interpretations often contradict each other. How can one person see cruelty while another sees maturity? How can one call you arrogant while another finally begins to respect you? Because they're no longer responding to you. They are responding to themselves. Your silence has become a psychological mirror, and mirrors rarely lie. This is precisely why emotionally manipulative people become uncomfortable when you stop reacting. Your reactions allowed them to maintain a certain image of reality. As long as you defended yourself, they remained the victim. As long as you apologized, they remained innocent. As long as you kept explaining, they never had to question themselves. But silence interrupts that cycle. It removes the script. It forces everyone to improvise. For psychologically healthy people, this creates curiosity. For emotionally immature people, it creates panic. Because without your predictable reactions, they must finally confront emotions they spent years avoiding. Jung understood that consciousness expands whenever projection is withdrawn. Every time we stop blaming someone else for our emotional state, we recover a piece of ourselves. That process is uncomfortable. It demands honesty, humility, courage. Many people would rather fight another person than meet their own shadow, which is why a transformation may trigger unexpected hostility. Not because you harmed anyone, but because your new boundaries silently invite others to examine themselves. And few invitations are more frightening than that. Have you ever noticed how some people become strangely persistent the moment you stop explaining yourself? They send another message, then another. They demand answers, closure, reasons, not because they truly seek understanding, but because uncertainty is unbearable for the unconscious mind. The unknown forces self-reflection. Certainty allows projection to survive. Your silence becomes a question they cannot answer. And unanswered questions are dangerous, because eventually, the mind stops searching outside and begins searching within. That is where real transformation begins. Not only for you, but sometimes for those around you as well. Still, there is another layer beneath all of this. Projection explains why people react, but does not explain why silence feels so powerful. Why can saying nothing completely change the emotional balance of a relationship? Why does the absence of words often communicate more than hours of conversation? To answer that, we must understand one of the rarest forms of psychological strength, the ability to remain internally still, while the world desperately tries to pull you back into chaos. Because true silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of mastery. Block 5, The Discipline of Silence. Chapter 4, 5.500 characters. Silence has always been misunderstood. To some, it looks like weakness. To others, it appears as indifference. Many mistake it for fear. But genuine silence is none of these things. True silence is one of the highest forms of psychological discipline. Anyone can react. Anyone can raise their voice. Anyone can defend themselves when they feel misunderstood. But remaining centered while your emotions beg for expression, that requires a different kind of strength. The modern world rewards speed. Instant repli, instant opinion, instant outrage. Every notification invites your attention. Every disagreement demands your response. Every accusation pressures you to defend your identity. And without realizing it, Many people spend their entire lives reacting instead of living. Their emotions are no longer guided from within. They are managed by whatever happens around them. A single comment changes their mood. One message determines the quality of their day. Someone else's approval becomes the measure of their own worth. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity begins the moment the individual stops allowing the external world to dictate the movements of the inner world. That is far more difficult than it sounds, because the ego desperately wants certainty. It wants to be understood. It wants to be validated. It wants justice. It wants the last word. But the self, the deeper center of the personality Jung described, seeks something entirely different. It seeks wholeness, and wholeness rarely argues. Imagine standing beside a deep mountain lake. When the surface is disturbed by every gust of wind, the water reflects nothing. The image becomes distorted, broken, unclear. But when the lake becomes completely still, everything appears with astonishing clarity. The mountains, the sky, the smallest details invisible only moments before. Your mind works in exactly the same way. An agitated mind cannot perceive reality accurately. It only perceives its own emotional turbulence. This is why silence is so transformative. Not because it changes other people immediately, but because it changes the quality of your perception. For the first time, you begin observing instead of assuming, listening instead of preparing your defense, questioning instead of reacting. Patterns that were once invisible suddenly become impossible to ignore. You notice who only contacts you when they need something, who respects your boundaries, and who becomes offended by them, who celebrates your growth, and who quietly resents it. Silence does not create these truths. It reveals them. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of human relationships. Many people believe communication solves every problem. Sometimes it does. But there are situations where more words only create more confusion. There comes a point when every additional explanation weakens your position. Not because your reasons are wrong, but because some people are not searching for understanding. They're searching for access. Access to your emotions. Access to your attention. Access to your energy. As long as they can keep you explaining yourself, they remain connected to your inner world. The moment you stop feeding that cycle, something remarkable happens. The emotional balance changes. People accustomed to controlling conversations through guilt suddenly lose their advantage. Those who depended on your constant reassurance become uncomfortable. Not because silence is cruel, but because silence removes emotional dependency from the equation. Jung understood that individuation demands separation from unconscious collective patterns. In practical terms, this means learning to disappoint expectations that were never truly yours to fulfill. At first, this feels unnatural. Your instincts whisper that something is wrong. You feel guilty for protecting your time. You feel selfish for protecting your peace. You begin questioning yourself. Maybe I should answer. Maybe I should explain. Maybe I'm overreacting. But ask yourself a different question. Who taught you that your peace must always come second? Who convinced you that protecting your emotional life is selfish? Was it wisdom or was it conditioning? Every meaningful transformation requires breaking an old identity, and every old identity resists being abandoned. This resistance is normal. The uncomfortable feeling you experience when setting healthy boundaries is often not a sign that you're making a mistake. It is evidence that your nervous system is adapting to a completely different way of living. The life where your value no longer depends on constant availability, where your kindness is offered freely, not extracted through obligation, where your silence is no longer an apology, but a declaration of self-respect. Eventually, something extraordinary begins to happen. The urge to react grows weaker, not because life becomes easier, but because your inner center becomes stronger. You stop experiencing every disagreement as a personal attack, every criticism as proof of failure, every rejection as evidence that you are unworthy. For the first time, you realize that peace is not something the world gives you. It is something the world can no longer take from you. And once that realization settles into your mind, There is no returning to the person you used to be, because you have discovered something infinitely more valuable than approval, inner authority. Yet one final step remains. Silence protects your energy, but protection alone is not enough. Nature never creates empty spaces. The energy you stop wasting must now be invested somewhere else. Otherwise, old habits quietly return. The question is no longer, what should I stop giving away? The real question becomes, what kind of person am I becoming with the energy I have finally reclaimed? That is where Jung's journey reaches its highest point. Not survival, not approval, but transformation. Block 6. The courage to become who you really are. Chapter 5, 5.500 characters. There comes a moment in every meaningful life when comfort and authenticity can no longer coexist. It is rarely dramatic. There are no grand announcements, no applause. No one congratulates you for the invisible battles taking place inside your own mind. The transformation begins quietly, with a single decision. A decision to stop betraying yourself in small, almost invisible ways. Carl Jung believed that the greatest task of a human life was not success, not popularity, not even happiness. It was individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you were always meant to be. This journey is often misunderstood. Many imagine it as a path toward becoming someone new. Jung saw it differently. Individuation is not about creating another personality. It is about removing everything that was never truly yours. Every borrowed belief, every role adopted to gain approval, every fear inherited from family, culture, or childhood, every mask worn for survival. Imagine a sculptor standing before a massive block of marble. To an ordinary observer, it is simply stone, heavy, rough, featureless. But the sculptor sees something hidden inside. He does not create the statue. He reveals it. With every strike of the chisel, something false disappears. The same is true of psychological growth. You do not become yourself by adding more identities. You become yourself by removing everything that prevents your authentic nature from emerging. That process is rarely comfortable, because every layer you remove once protected you. The people pleaser protected you from rejection. The perfectionist protected you from criticism. The rescuer protected you from feeling unnecessary. The constantly available version of yourself protected you from loneliness. These identities were not mistakes. They were survival strategies. At one point in your life, they probably saved you. But what once protected you can eventually become your prison. Many adults continue living according to emotional rules they created as frightened children. If everyone is happy, I'll be safe. If I'm useful, I'll be loved. If I never disappoint anyone, I'll never be abandoned. The unconscious mind clings to these beliefs because they once worked. But life changes. Growth demands new ways of existing. And what helped you survive at 10 years old may quietly destroy your peace at 40. This is why individuation feels like loss before it feels like freedom. You lose certainty. You lose old identities. Sometimes, you lose relationships built upon those identities. Not everyone will celebrate your transformation. Some people only knew how to love the version of you that sacrificed itself. When sacrifice ends, their affection sometimes disappears with it. That realization hurts, but it also reveals something invaluable. Love that depends on self-abandonment was never love. It was dependency disguised as connection. Jung warned that the path toward the self often requires walking through profound psychological loneliness. Not because isolation is the goal, but because authenticity cannot be discovered inside constant noise. There are conversations that only silence can have with your soul. Questions no crowd can answer. Who are you when nobody expects anything from you? Who remains when every role falls away? What dreams still belong to you? And which ones were borrowed from someone else's expectations? These questions cannot be answered intellectually. They must be lived, one boundary at a time, one difficult conversation at a time, one moment of choosing your peace over your fear at a time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop chasing validation because your identity no longer depends on applause. You stop fearing rejection because rejection no longer defines your worth. You stop explaining yourself because your life has become your explanation. People notice the difference, not because you are louder, but because you are calmer, not because you demand respect, but because you no longer negotiate your dignity. Presence replaces performance. Peace replaces urgency. Confidence replaces approval. This is the paradox Jung understood so deeply. The person who no longer needs to control how others perceive them often becomes the most difficult person to manipulate. Because manipulation requires emotional dependence, and emotional dependence cannot survive inside genuine self-awareness. That is why becoming emotionally unavailable is never the final destination. It is simply the doorway. Beyond it lies something infinitely greater. A life directed from the inside instead of controlled from the outside. A life where your choices arise from conviction, not fear, from truth, not performance, from inner freedom, not unconscious conditioning. And once you have experienced even a glimpse of that freedom, returning to your former life becomes almost impossible because you finally understand something that changes everything. The greatest prison was never other people. It was the version of yourself you believed you had to become in order to deserve love. Block 7. The day everything changes. Final chapter plus conclusion 4.000 characters. There's a quiet moment that almost no one talks about. It arrives long after the difficult conversations, long after the guilt begins to fade, long after you've stopped explaining yourself to people who are never willing to understand. At first, nothing seems different. The world continues moving exactly as it always has. People still criticize. Some still misunderstand you. Others quietly drift away. From the outside, it may even appear that you have lost something. But inside, an entirely different reality is beginning to take shape. For the first time in years, you wake up without feeling responsible for everyone's emotions. You no longer measure your worth by how useful you are. You stop carrying burdens that were never yours to carry. And almost without noticing, you begin breathing differently. The constant tension that once followed you everywhere slowly disappears. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because your inner world is no longer controlled by every external event. Carl Jung believed that the goal of psychological development was never perfection. It was wholeness. Wholeness means accepting that you cannot be loved by everyone. You cannot satisfy every expectation. You cannot rescue every person who refuses to rescue themselves. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all, you were never meant to. Many people spend their entire lives searching for freedom in the outside world. A better job, a different relationship, another city, more money, more recognition. Yet they remain prisoners because the prison was never outside. The prison was the unconscious belief that their value depended on someone else's approval. The day that belief begins to disappear, everything changes. Not because people change, but because you do. You stop negotiating your peace. You stop abandoning yourself to avoid disappointing others. You stop confusing attention with love and sacrifice with connection. Instead, you begin choosing relationships where respect flows naturally, where silence is not punishment, where boundaries are not seen as rejection, where love does not require you to disappear. That is the kind of life Jung believed was possible for every individual willing to confront the unconscious. Not an easy life, not a life without pain, but an authentic one. And authenticity has a quiet power that cannot be imitated. It does not demand attention. It naturally attracts it. It does not seek validation. It no longer needs it. Perhaps that is why truly grounded people often appear mysterious. Not because they're hiding something, but because they no longer feel the need to constantly explain who they are. Their actions speak. Their peace speaks. Even their silence speaks. So tonight, before you fall asleep, ask yourself one simple question. Who would I become if I stopped living according to everyone else's expectations? Do not answer too quickly. Sit with the question. Allow it to follow you into tomorrow. Because the answer will not come from this video. It will come from your own life. From every boundary you choose to protect. From every unnecessary battle you decide not to fight. From every moment you choose authenticity over approval. That is where real freedom begins. Not in changing the world, but in finally coming home to yourself. If this message resonated with you, write these simple words in the comments. I choose inner freedom. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but as a promise to yourself. A reminder that from this day forward, your peace is no longer something you will negotiate. And if you're ready to continue this journey into Carl Jung's deepest psychological insights, stay with us and watch the next video. Because this is only the beginning.